So, good evening and welcome to Industrial Archaeology, Revisiting the Founding Era, hosted by Carroll County Public Library and sponsored by the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History and the American Library Association. I'm Dorothy Stoltz with the library, and we have a wonderful panel for you this evening. Just to go over a little bit of housekeeping. Please use the chat box in the Facebook page or however you're joining us, and we'll get to as many questions as we can after the presentation. The recording for tonight will be available on all of these social media pages, including the library's YouTube page, Facebook, and Twitter, and the Facebook pages of Union Mills Homestead, the Historical Society of Carroll County, Catoctin Furnace, and the Carroll County Celebrating America initiative. So we're so delighted to have so many streaming partners tonight. We have, through the grant, some books that, if you're interested, we have a giveaway book. You can email me, Dorothy Stoltz, and I'll put my email address in the comments section so you can link right to it. Put down the title in preference order of what you would like, and as long as supplies last, we'll be able to send this out, indicate which branch in which you'd like to pick it up. So we're so grateful for the grant helping to sponsor tonight, and that's Gilder Lehrman and the American Library Association. So we have a lot of different partners and supporters for tonight's program, including Carroll County Public Schools, Celebrating America, the Union Mills Homestead, Gersdale Academy, the Maryland Center for History and Culture, Catoctin Furnace, the Maryland Heritage Area, and the Revisiting the Founding Era at Gilder Lehrman. So now I'd like to introduce Judge Joe Getty, who is our moderator, and he's with the Maryland Court of Appeals and wonderful history buff. And so let's please welcome Judge Joe Getty.
Thank you, Dorothy. We have a wonderful panel this evening. Some of you may have been with us last fall when, through the Carroll County Public Library and support from the Gilder Lehrman Institute, we did a program focused on the founding era. And we looked at the time period around the American Revolution. Using the Gilder Lehrman's book that's in the upper corner of this slide, Revisiting the Founding Era, our panel looked at, using that book as a model, themes from the settlement period leading to independence, freedom, and crafting a new government. And we did that by looking at some of the leaders, thinkers, political leaders, writers who lived in the area that today is Carroll County. The settlement pattern in this region up to the Revolutionary War period was primarily small farmsteads and turnpike road villages scattered through the Baltimore and Frederick County portions of what later became Carroll County. So when we looked at the Revolutionary period and its leaders, some members of the panel, Sam Raleigh of the Union Mills Homestead, Alexander Lothstein of the Maryland Center for History and Culture, and David Greenspoon of Gersdale Academy, talked about certain personalities and what our local people thought about freedom and the philosophy of independence in our country. We've added to the panel this time Elizabeth Comer, who's with EAC Archaeology, and Rob Warner, an archaeologist, to add another perspective that I'll get to in a moment. But tonight we're looking at the period immediately after the Revolution. It is a period of significant economic growth, and the foundation of that growth are the agricultural resources in this region, primarily flour, and the mineral resources, settlers explored for copper, for gold, for other minerals, but the primary one in Maryland that became important was iron. Flour and iron. An odd combination to today's technological thinking, but two products that undergird the growth and development and the economic prosperity of this region in the late 1700s. The economic vitality of this region is based upon a burgeoning industrial development, and it led to, in the 1790s, numerous villages and small towns developing as commercial centers for craftsmen, for trades, and for small industries. Taneytown was the major commercial center due to its location at the intersection of two major routes, a route from Baltimore to the west and a route up and down the Piedmont, York to Taneytown to Frederick, and parts north and south from there. And because of that, Taneytown became the first real commercial center in our region that developed crafts. There was an early foundry there by Matthias Schroyer, and there were skilled craftsmen such as the clockmaker Eli Bentley, who made clocks from 1790 to 1828 in Taneytown. This theme can best be illustrated by looking at Dennis Griffiths' map of Maryland, published in 1794. Griffith focuses on what was important to the community, and the map shows the waterways, the roads, the towns and villages, and other things such as water-powered mills, furnaces, forges, and things that were involved in the commercial trade of the period. On this map, which is a detail of Griffiths' map, showing the county boundary line that follows Pars Ridge between Baltimore County, the brown area, and Frederick County, the pink area, that later became Carroll County. You can see Westminster right at the center of that pink and brown distinguishing area. You can see from the map very clearly small round circles that indicate water-powered mills and small squares that indicate the taverns along the major routes for getting primarily to the Port of Baltimore. You can see the two early towns. I mentioned Westminster right at the boundary line, and to its northwest, Taneytown. And it's interesting, in 1794, you have the absence of the other towns that developed really in the 1790s. For example, coming out of Baltimore, you can see what is today Maryland Route 30, and there's a tavern called Fowble's at where Homestead is. There's another tavern called Nace's south of where Manchester is. But neither of those communities had developed, nor had New Windsor, Union Bridge, nor Mount Airy and Sykesville, which are really developments from the era of the railroad. So you have your major transportation routes to the port, and Alex Lothstein will talk a little bit about the important role the Port of Baltimore played to the economic expansion here. You have the flour mills north of Westminster on this map. There's a mill shown that says Bankers. It's actually the Bankert family that we know very well in Carroll County, Bankert. And the Bankers mill on this map is the predecessor, with the Shrivers purchasing that mill just a few years after this map was made. And Samuel Raleigh of the Union Mills Homestead Foundation will tell us about the growing industrial complex that revolved around that mill. And also, just outside of Westminster to the west, there's a word Leigh, Leigh, and the symbol associated with that is an iron furnace. So this is the Laymaster iron furnace, and Elizabeth and Rob will be telling us a little bit about iron throughout the entire region, as well as the Laymaster, what we know about the Laymaster furnace. And so to sum it up, David Greenspan will give us sort of a national perspective of what was going on here in this region, the economic prosperity and growth that occurred. And with that, because the key to this growth was the phenomenal expansion of the Port of Baltimore immediately after the Revolutionary War. One of the interesting facts to the Port of Baltimore's growth is that because of the Chesapeake Bay, it was so far west from other ports, such as Philadelphia, New York, ports down in Virginia, that wagon transportation was less costly to get to Baltimore, and that helped to drive the growth in the port. And Alex Lothstein will tell us more about this period of expansion in the Port of Baltimore. Alex?
Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. My name is Alex Lothstein, and I'm the Museum Learning Manager at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. So, like Judge Getty said, I'm going to talk about the growth of the Port of Baltimore, the growth of shipping and trade in Maryland, and how actually the wheat industry aided that, and also how it propped up a farming middle class. So to begin, I just want to talk a little bit about immediately following the American Revolution. So after the American Revolution, the United States, Maryland, Baltimore, and the surrounding counties entered an economic recession. It was a major economic recession. Prior to the Revolution, the American economy was basically propped up primarily by the British mercantile system. British ships brought in imports from throughout the world to American ports, and American goods left on British and American ships to go to British-controlled ports. In terms of American traders, American goods and traders received preferential treatment by the British. They sailed on British protected shipping lanes. They had preferential access to British ports, especially in the West Indies, and limited, if not non-existent, duties on their goods at these ports. So American traders before the American Revolution had so many benefits with them. But the American Revolution changed all this. And while Americans received their political independence, American merchants lost this preferential access to the British markets. Furthermore, they faced higher duties by the British, they lost access to the British West Indies, and they lost the protection of the Royal Navy. So they were basically out on their own. And adding to the struggle, Americans still owed debts from before the American Revolution. So owing of debts by merchants and the country, the loss of access to stable ports, and the loss of protection put American merchants and farmers, especially in Maryland, in a very rough position economically. So this is what America is coming out of. In addition, actually, the previous reliance on primarily British merchant vessels meant that there was a smaller supply of American merchant ships post-war. So all of this led to kind of what looks like a dark view of American shipping and shipbuilding following the American Revolution. And while it was a dark time, it actually had a major benefit to the Port of Baltimore, its shipbuilders, and the goods from the surrounding county. This economic vacuum would allow a lot of opportunities to emerge. And so I want to begin by discussing shipbuilding in Baltimore, because you can't trade across the ocean if you don't have a ship. So following the American Revolution, the Port of Baltimore boomed, but it wasn't always like that. The Port of Baltimore was small during the American Revolution. It was almost non-existent and really focused on supplying the city rather than connecting Baltimore to the world. If merchants wanted to trade their items, especially in kind of central Maryland, they would go to Annapolis rather than Baltimore. On the Eastern Shore, you would have tobacco trade, and the ships would actually go directly up to the plantations and would be loaded there. But Baltimore was basically non-existent. And it started to emerge in about 1761 when Edward Fell was deeded the land around the Port of Baltimore and Copus Harbor, and he began leasing shipbuilding and merchant spots to individuals. This area later was renamed Fells Point, and in 1773, the city of Baltimore actually annexed this land and began developing a shipbuilding and trade sector at Fells Point. And so this image that you see in front of you is a digitally recreated image of Baltimore's port in 1815. Just a little background, this can be found and explored on your own by searching for either Bearings of Baltimore map, or if you just type in interactive Baltimore map of 1815, it will show up as well. It allows you to zoom in, zoom out, kind of explore Baltimore in 1815. It was actually created in partnership by the Maryland Center for History and Culture and University of Maryland, Baltimore County. We worked together to develop this. But I want you to notice a couple of things. First, notice how prevalent the port is to the city and how centrally located it is, as well as notice all the shipyards around Fells Point and throughout the rest of the city as well. Baltimore was a shipbuilding and trading town. That's what it was built for. That's what it got its money. That's how it grew. And you can see that the Port of Baltimore wrapped around almost the entire inner harbor and around Jones Falls. So this is a major industry. Trade, merchants, shipbuilding is the major industry of the Port of Baltimore. And so it needs people to deliver goods in order to grow. And so after the Revolution, merchants needed ships to prop up American trade. And in Maryland, the shipbuilders were at the Baltimore port, the Baltimore harbor. And so we then look at what ships were they building. Well, they produced ships of all sorts, but their two main products were going to be brigs and schooners. And specifically, the schooners were based off of the Virginia pilot schooners, and they began to emerge in the upper Chesapeake during the American Revolution. They were used a little bit as privateers then. The Baltimore schooners were an improved version of the Virginia schooners. They had V-shaped hulls, allowing them to glide through the water at fast rates of speed. Furthermore, they were sizable, so they could transport a relatively large amounts of cargo quickly, and they had shallow drafts through the Chesapeake, so they were basically able to access almost every single port, whether that be in the Caribbean or even in Europe or even further east. These schooners were designed with a lot of sails, a large sail area, which allowed them to catch even the lightest winds, which would then allow them to outpace larger and smaller ships. And most importantly, during the War of 1812, these ships could be well armed for their size, which is one reason why later on the Baltimore Clippers, which the schooners would became privateers during the War of 1812. So with Baltimore producing these schooners / clippers, how did the Port of Baltimore emerge and connect Carroll County to the world? So that's going to be done mostly by its exports. There were two major exports that came out of Baltimore. The first was tobacco. And so while I mentioned tobacco, a lot of tobacco came from the Eastern Shore. You did have tobacco plantations delivering at the Port of Baltimore. Tobacco tended to be planted by wealthy farmers with more land. You needed more land to plant tobacco because it destroys the soil. It's hard labor, so a lot of these wealthy farmers owned enslaved individuals to farm the land. But the wealthiest of wealthiest farmers needed to find new trading partners in Europe for their tobacco. They couldn't trade with England anymore, so they needed to now trade directly to the European market rather than through British intermediaries. And they began trading to the mainland of Europe, bringing in profit and allowing them to buy the new goods coming into the port. But the second major export, and actually more central to Carroll County, was going to be wheat. And I'm not going to go too much into it, but while tobacco tended to be a Southern Maryland and Eastern Shore export, wheat tended to be a Northern and Central Maryland export. And so that was the most popular export out of the Port of Baltimore. And while wealthy planters grew wheat to offset a slight reduction in tobacco prices, the tenant farmers and smaller producers around Baltimore and the Frederick counties and Baltimore County turned to wheat as well. Wheat had its benefits and its drawbacks. It was easily saleable and transportable good. You can make good profit off of it. You could easily load it onto a ship. And also it didn't fall under inspection acts like tobacco did. So they saved some costs that way. The smaller planters were able to easily transport it to the Port of Baltimore through the major roads. And then these merchants would sell it to Europe and the West Indies. But what's really interesting about wheat in the merchant trade with wheat is when Europe was at peace, there was no profit. But when Europe was at war, the small planters in Maryland made large amounts of profit. So it's actually beneficial that the Napoleonic Wars kind of started up very soon after the American Revolution, because these merchants and these wheat farmers in Maryland actually were able to make a large amount of profit off of that. But Baltimore ships didn't just bring Maryland wheat to Europe, but also to the West Indies and the Caribbean. And along the coastal paths in America, wheat was a major moneymaker for small Maryland planters. And the statistics I'm about to say are from before the American Revolution, and they're kind of related to the port of Annapolis, but you can kind of see how wheat is growing. In 1749, 82,684 bushels of grain left the port of Annapolis. By 1774, that number jumped to 472,783 bushels left. So you can see there's a major jump in merchants taking wheat out of Maryland. And so wheat trade had an economic power. While wheat left the Baltimore market on clipper ships, money and goods came back. And so wheat provided a transitional stage economically. Small planters who were too poor to plant tobacco became wealthy enough to buy the new goods coming into Baltimore. And so while it's hard to see in this image, but again, it can be explored online, there are many markets in Baltimore. In 1815, you had Fells Point Market, you had the Marsh Market, which was also called the Center Market. You had the Fish Market, the Horse Market, the Hanover Market, and the Lexington Market. And these markets were places where farmers, merchants, and others could sell and buy many of the goods being imported. And so some of the goods that this new middle-class merchants or these new middle-class farmers were able to purchase were goods from the China trade and goods from other parts of Europe and from the West Indies. So some of the goods they might have been able to buy would have been table settings, teas, spices, and all sorts of goods not previously accessible. These markets made it much easier for the new middle-class farmers to buy these new goods. And as a result, a new merchant middle class was formed off the back of wheat and flour production. So by the time you hit 1810, 1815, you actually get a very large merchant and wealthy class forming in Baltimore based off the Baltimore port, in the port of Baltimore. The city is going to grow even more. The Mount Vernon area, which is a very wealthy area, starts to grow and become bigger. Societies are formed, merchant societies are formed. More and more shipyards are going to be built to kind of handle this trade. And as Judge Getty said, as ships were able to travel longer and longer distances, the location of Baltimore up the Chesapeake, protected from the weather, protected by Fort McHenry, and also protected from privateers or pirates, and its location fairly far west was going to allow for more and more ships to come in. And that's also going to be one reason why later on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad is going to pick and settle in Baltimore, because it allows it to get to the Ohio River area quicker. So that's kind of how the port of Baltimore grew, with all these goods coming in, and grew from a small port to a major industrial port. I should say after the American Revolution, by the time of the 1810, Baltimore is about the second to third largest city in the United States. And that is due to the port of Baltimore and due to the wheat and merchants, actually the wheat, iron, and traders coming from the surrounding counties, such as Baltimore County, Frederick County, and what would become Carroll County. But if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer, or if anyone has any comments.
I think we'll allow the questions to come in through the chat feature, and we'll address the questions at the end. But it's a perfect transition to Union Mills Homestead. Union Mills is a fascinating facility for people to visit in Carroll County. It's a wonderful historic site to address the themes of flour production, and that flour went to Baltimore, and then it went into the overseas trade. And as this slide shows, it became an early industrial complex. And with that, I'll turn it over to Samuel Riley with the Union Mills Homestead Foundation.
Thank you, Judge Getty. I appreciate the introduction. And Alex did a great setup for the Union Mills story, which is really one of, I guess, by example of the early industrial complexes that developed across Maryland's northern Piedmont, Frederick County, what's now Carroll County, northern Baltimore County, in the era following the nation's founding. And so Union Mills started as a business enterprise between two brothers. They got together, Andrew and David Shriver, and they had this idea to combine their various skills and their resources. And so they bought this property that was once Banker's Mill, and they built this large mill that you see depicted on this photo here. And the name really was defined what the business was. It was a union, not just of the two brothers, but of two mills. It was a flour mill and a sawmill at the site. And then that developed into what was essentially an early industrial complex. The story was one of economic and industrial growth. There was a wide variety of industries that were needed to support these mills, including a tannery and a variety of other cottage industries, such as woodworking. They needed to make barrels for their flour. They needed a blacksmith, and so on. So there was a variety of industries that sprung up around these grist mills that were built at crossroads across the Piedmont area. But with Union Mills, it says union, and it implies some sort of equality between the two mills, the grist mill and the sawmill. But don't let the name fool you. Union Mills was all about the flour. And as depicted in these photographs you see, it was essentially water and wheat in one door and flour out the other. These mills, when they were built, were really essentially factories. They were the first automated industrial machines, large factories that were started in America's industrial development, really at the tip of the spear of Maryland's industrial revolution, or the country's industrial revolution. And this mill was fully automated. So it literally could have the wheat come in and flour be produced in a fairly quick period of time. And then it would be packed into barrels and introduced into the stream of commerce. So as soon as you say the word commerce, as mentioned by Alex, you almost immediately have to think of transportation. And as successful as this mill was, it would never have been as successful as it was without the road network that developed to support its operation. So you see here in this map, it's a modern day map, but with this red image of the Baltimore-Reisterstown Turnpike thrown across it. You see the green star, which is Union Mills, and you see the blue star at the bottom, which is the Port of Baltimore. So the Baltimore-Reisterstown Turnpike literally connected Union Mills directly to the Port of Baltimore, where its flour could end up in international commerce. And it was true of grist mills all across the region. As these turnpikes were built, they actually were authorized under legislation in 1805. This road was completed in 1810. And along with it were authorized two other turnpikes, essentially what we now know as the Frederick Road and the York Road. The roads basically provided a network of roads from outlying areas on into the Port of Baltimore. And then if you see on this map, you see a whole host of other roads that we know today, and things like roads like Liberty Road, Falls Road, and all those roads were early turnpikes that were built in essentially a spoke of sorts out from the center of Baltimore, providing access from these outlying areas into the Baltimore's port, and also providing a way westward for young families as they were migrating west, and trade that rapidly developed between Baltimore and the Ohio River. So that's the story of the transportation network that was so effective in connecting these grist mills to the world of international trade. But I should note that factories or local industry, as it we kind of talk about it today. It wasn't a matter of getting in some sort of vehicle and going off to work, but as you know, is typified at Union Mills, you could literally walk out your front door and walk into the grist mill. So typically what you would have is this assemblage of residential and industrial structures that were built, and that is typical in the region. Is what grew up. Union Mills kind of personifies that. It is a great example of what transpired. And these homes weren't just used to live in; they were used for a variety of other features. It was a home office, of course, with folks the way they're working now. There are many home offices also, but so they had their offices, their businesses run out of their homes, but they also had a variety of other enterprises that developed. In Union Mills, Andrew Shriver became the postmaster for the area and ran a post office out of his home. And on the closest portion of this image you see on the right-hand side of the Shriver homestead, that section of the house that with that closest entrance you see was added in 1820 as part of an inn and tavern that Andrew Shriver operated. So it was literally not just a thriving grist mill and industrial complex, but also it was a stagecoach stop. As folks were traveling back and forth on the turnpikes, they needed a place to stop for a meal, stop for the night, and so they did. So you can see that these infrastructure projects not only facilitated commerce, but they also decided a lot of winners and losers along the way in terms of which businesses were successful. The operation at Union Mills was successful. 6 generations of this family lived here over a period of 160 years. And we're lucky enough to have had it preserved for us, and it can still be visited today. So maybe sometime we'll see you all, and thank you so much.
A number of the small towns in this area, Sam, also had families that ran tanneries. In Manchester, the Frankfurter family ran a tannery in town for many years. There were tanneries scattered throughout as a local industry. Tell us about the tannery at Union Mills.
So tanning was an important business for cottage industry. You needed leather for your shoes. We don't think about it quite as much, but you needed leather in those days for your horses, for saddles, and for industry. Those grist mills needed leather drive belts to make them operate. And so Union Mills did have a tannery. This family had many generations of experience with the tanning of leather. And over time, that business developed into a successful industry in its own right, and became one of the 2 largest industries that was in operating at Union Mills in the course of the 1800s. But it was there were about in 1860, I think there were about 8 or 10 tanneries in Carroll County that were operating and providing leather, which was an important industrial commodity by that point in time.
You also had a cooper shop there at the mill, making barrels. Obviously, the staves were made out of wood for the barrels. Where do you think they got the iron for the cooper shop barrels?
Well, there were iron was an important part of a grist mill. Something had to hold all that wood together. And what's interesting is vertically integrated as the Shriver operation was, they had just about everything covered. They must have bought that iron somewhere, and that's something that we need to dig into our records and find the answer on. But it could very well have come from a place like Laymaster's Furnace Hills, which was just on the other side of Westminster.
So that's our next topic, iron and the development of the iron industry in Maryland. There were lots of explorations early in the history of this Baltimore County, Frederick County area, looking for mineral resources. There were copper mines in the Patapsco Valley, in the Sykesville, Eldersburg area. There were efforts to find other mineral resources. And we're going to turn now to Elizabeth Comer and Rob Warner to talk a little bit about the entire iron industry in central Maryland.
Thank you, Joe. Rob and I will be reviewing the history of iron making in central Maryland with a particular emphasis on Catoctin Furnace, but we'll also be, of course, talking about sites in Carroll County and surrounding areas. In the early years, it's really, you can't overstate the importance of iron in the development of the young United States and the colonies. The British Parliament encouraged the iron industry in the colonies because there was a huge depletion of trees in Britain. Basically, they had cut them down to build ships and to make iron, and that diminished the competitiveness with other European countries. So the British were very reliant on colonial imports of pig iron. In 1719, the Maryland General Assembly approved an act for the encouragement of an iron manufacture in the colony, and they offered, because it was so important, 100 acres of land to anyone who would establish an iron furnace or a forge in Maryland. In 1722, laborers in the iron industry were exempted from militia duties, and this all indicates just how important iron was. Principico Iron Works in Cecil County was operated as early as 1723, and it produced pig iron for sale in London. And then the Patuxent Iron Works, founded in the 1730s by Richard Snowden, was another one that came up very quickly and was a possible training place for the Johnsons, who later founded Catoctin Furnace. In 1750, the British Parliament passed the Iron Act, which allowed colonial iron to be exported to Britain duty-free to meet the British needs, but the British prohibited the manufacture of finished iron products in the colonies. That way, the British could sell the finished iron products back to the colonies. Very clever. But of course, we all know how that little story ended. So in Western Maryland, there were many iron works established, and 4 of the 10 iron furnaces built in Maryland from 1722 to 1774 were in the middle part of the colony. So let's talk about the Johnson brothers. They came to what is now Frederick County very early. They were landed gentry who supported the Revolutionary War effort, and they were responsible for the establishment of several furnaces. James Johnson was a skilled ironmaster. He may have learned from Snowden's ironworks near his childhood home. And they began with the Hampton furnace in nearby Emmitsburg. The problem there, and this was a problem that many iron furnaces would face, was a lack of sufficient mineral resources. The ore was just not rich enough. So they began building Catoctin Furnace in 1774. It went into blast just a few days after the Declaration of Independence in 1776. After that, the Johnsons established yet more iron furnaces, but Catoctin remained their principal furnace. So I'd like to talk to you just very briefly about Catoctin Furnace from 1776 until approximately the War of 1812. As I said earlier, the Johnson brothers, 4 brothers who were, shall we say, vertically integrated. They even had a brother in London helping them with the trade. There was, they could make the iron, sell the iron, and then very importantly, get the capital and lobby the politicos to sell the iron. So they really did have it all sewn up. And they also had a great resource in the water power, the iron ore, the limestone close at hand, and an entire mountain of wood. So all these things helped make Catoctin Furnace very successful. However, after the War of 1812 and the Depression of 1819, Catoctin Furnace, like many furnaces, went broke. And now Rob is going to bring you up to speed with what happened then.
But first I want to talk a little bit about another important family that was involved in the early iron industry, that being the Hughes brothers, Samuel and Daniel Hughes, who are out of Baltimore. They actually were born in Hagerstown. They moved to Baltimore, became merchants, and then shortly after made some very good investments and then moved back to Hagerstown a few years later. They started buying up massive amounts of property. Along with their father, they established ironworks in Mount Etna. They established ironworks, but they also bought up existing ironworks, the most important being Frederick Forge, which will later become Antietam Ironworks. They also bought up the remnants of Principio furnace as well, and reestablished it as Cecil furnace. They were also, like the Johnsons, ardent supporters of the revolutionary cause. So they actually sought contracts from the Maryland Assembly and Continental Congress to cast cannons at their furnace for militia and the army, and then they cast some of the first Maryland cannons during the Revolution. And they also were contracted in 1777 for 30 heavy caliber guns, and this contract was renewed the following year. So the next, I want to talk also briefly about Laymaster, who was operating in Carroll County. So we've talked about the Hughes brothers and the Johnson brothers, who were both adamantly supporting the revolutionary cause, but Laymaster was a royalist through and through. He came from Lancashire, England in the 18th century. He established himself around Avondale in 1765. He started up a furnace there on his property. He had some ore deposits, an ore bank. He had access to the materials that you would need to start an iron furnace. But unfortunately, it only lasted 1 to 2 blasts, and then he abandoned the project. The furnace was actually sold in 1767. For a short time, he actually fled the colonies to the Bahamas during the Revolution, and returned later in poor health. The property itself, it left its mark. It retained the name Furnace Hills and Lay Furnace. The people that moved in there after him, the Van Bibber family, acquired the furnace property and allowed ore and limestone quarrying to continue until even after the Civil War. So,
so going back to the iron industry and what was happening in Catoctin Furnace, there was a great deal of competition from after the War of 1812 from the Lake Superior region and, interestingly enough, Alabama. So that really did affect the production of iron, and British iron products rebounded in the late 1820s despite the high tariffs, and that again hurt the iron industry in the United States. Catoctin and Antietam survived. A lot of furnaces did not. And again, there were waxes and wanes. There were good years and bad years, but they did survive. In the 1840s, there was a tax on imported iron, and old furnaces had to be improved because new technology was coming in. And Catoctin was one in which borrowed money, but money nonetheless that John Bryn brought, was able to keep the furnace, in a modernized and keep it running. So Catoctin was sold in 1843 to Peregrine Fitzhugh. He was from Washington County. And I should go back a minute and tell you that throughout this time period, the majority of the workers at Catoctin were enslaved. That number began to drop under the ownership of Peregrine Fitzhugh. And by the time the Civil War began, there were very few, if any, enslaved workers at Catoctin. They had been replaced by the immigrant iron workers coming in very large numbers from Europe. And Rob is going to talk about the labor now at Catoctin and other furnaces.
Okay. Pictured here is a photo of some of the archaeology that was undertaken in the 70s at Catoctin Furnace. It's an African American cemetery for workers at Catoctin Furnace. So this is just a recognition that most of the labor in these early years of iron production was specialist enslaved labor. In particular, we have a few numbers. We know Denton Jakes operated an ironworks at Fort Frederick in 1775, which relied almost exclusively on enslaved labor. James Johnson owned more than 70 slaves who were employed at the manor and who also helped at one of his early endeavors, Bush Creek Forge. At the beginning of the 19th century, the price of skilled enslaved people rose, and the owners had to provide all the necessities for the slaves, which added to their costs. So as free labor became more plentiful, it was actually cheaper to hire workers for a yearly wage of 15 to 16 pounds, and it was actually purchase enslaved. And we can see this transition archaeologically. We did some dendrochronology on some of the buildings at Catoctin Furnace, and we know that a number of the worker houses were built in the 1820s. So we have this. We can actually see this in the archaeological record. Some of the Antietam ironworks kind of held out, and that transition occurred a little bit later. We know in particular that there was actually a revolt in 1836 when under the ownership of John McPherson Greene, who actually had a hand at Catoctin Furnace as well. And it was resolved peacefully, but Greene was surprised that they felt like it was an insult or ungrateful when this occurred.
And finally, in order for an iron furnace to be successful, obviously the location was critical. We have many accounts, for instance, of iron furnaces where Mr. Blackford, who left Catoctin, went to Virginia and purchased an iron furnace that didn't have nearly enough ore source of fuel. And so Catoctin, not to blow our horn, but it did always have enough of all of the four major components. And of course, that meant that it operated for 130 years, not closing until 1903. And that was really due to the fact that it didn't do that final modernization to take it to the Bessemer process and to begin to make steel. So furnaces were incredibly important. You see them across the landscape. This map shows our new iron road, which is connecting iron furnaces all throughout Maryland and Pennsylvania. So we really appreciate you letting us talk about iron furnaces tonight. We're happy to take any questions, and we encourage you to visit your nearest iron furnace. If that's Catoctin, please come see us, but they're all interesting and they all have a great story to tell.
Twist to the iron resources in this region, and that is that there was a later period. You've talked about the early development of the iron furnaces, but the ore was a good, valuable resource. And in the late 1800s in Bachman's Valley, there are iron ore beds that are mined with a railroad built through the Bachman's Valley to connect into Pennsylvania to take the ore to Pittsburgh for smelting. And that operation lasted until about 1927. So it's a fascinating history throughout the time period as far as getting the ore. Probably a lot of the ore that was produced at these furnaces also went to local craftsmen and blacksmiths throughout the communities in this region. Mm-hmm. So we move now to David Greenspoon. I think he has a difficult task. Iron and flour, economic growth and prosperity, a transition in this region from subsistence farming to a more affluent middle class because of the market for flour, as Alex and Sam have described. How does this fit into the national picture, David? And you are on mute. most commonly expressed three words in modern culture. You're on mute.
It's certainly a sign of our time. So thank you very much, Judge Getty, for that introduction and posing that question. What has been described in today's excellent talks is really part of a larger shift in America, which radically transformed the nation economically, but also socially and culturally, in a process that historians have labeled the market revolution. First of all, work was becoming de-skilled over the course of the early 19th century, unevenly. Mr. Riley talked about tanneries and the production of shoes. Shoes shoemaking was an industry that became de-skilled and industrialized relatively early. Lynn, Massachusetts was well known as a producer of shoes, while things like shipbuilding and butchering were much harder. Another part of this process that I'd like to highlight is the interconnecting of markets that led many Americans to be more vulnerable to the mercy of market forces that were far beyond their control. So I'd like to take a few minutes and quickly survey some facets of what was happening in America through this transformation to hopefully offer some context, shed some light on a broader context on what these previous participants have stated. At the end of the 18th and through the early 19th century, markets became increasingly interconnected through turnpikes, canals, the improved navigation of existing waterways with new technology such as steamboats. Railroads would come later. What this meant was that farms that were relatively isolated and communities that were relatively isolated rapidly became increasingly connected to major urban centers and markets, such as New York, Philadelphia, and as we saw today, the Port of Baltimore. These more efficient, faster, and cheaper means of transportation had a profound effect on the Republic. Communities such as Rochester, Buffalo, and Utica went from backwater villages to substantial communities on the Erie Canal, first completed with great fanfare in 1825, where these communities were producing goods for distant markets, going up through Albany and then down the Hudson River to New York City. We talked a little bit about flour. Rochester, New York became also a great producer of flour. It also brought coastal products inland. When Long Island oysters appeared for sale in Western New York for the first time, the locals were stunned, and the appearance of these oysters made the local newspapers. This shift affected America's farmers in general, and it's a really broad generalization. They went from thinking about what crops their family needed for subsistence to thinking about how can I maximize my profit? What crops can I grow to make the most money? This, of course, opened a farm to greater profit, but also greater risk, as it was now exposed to a mercurial market where the price of crops rose and fell. So, in 1819, when the nation went through a severe economic downturn, many Americans now tied to these market forces felt the sting, and many lost their farms and their livelihoods. As a result, by 1837, when America experienced another economic panic, even more Americans were tied to the market and felt the blow of bankrupting banks and a contracting economy. All of this economic uncertainty helped spark religious revival as people looked for stability and hope in a world that promised potential profits, but was also really scary and held the potential of economic ruin. A traditional starting point of these religious revivals came in the summer of 1801 in Cane Ridge, Kentucky. 20,000 Americans attended the event, though probably not all at the same time. They were probably cycling through. The space is not big enough for 20,000 people. It was in a field near the local religious meeting house. Upstate Western New York, which was particularly impacted by these market forces and interconnecting of communities that today's presenters talked about, came to life with religion. Indeed, it earned upstate New York the nickname the Burnt Over District by the late 19th century, because the whole region caught fire with passionate religion. When evangelical preacher Charles Grandison Finney arrived in Rochester, New York, a community that had mushroomed with the creation of the Erie Canal, he captivated the attention of Rochesterians, and I did look up the proper demonym for people from Rochester, with passionate, intense, and terrifying speeches about their ability to save their own souls. This was a shift. This was unlike the Christianity of the Puritans hundreds of years later, where they emphasized predestination. Here, Protestants believed that they were the masters of their fate and their souls. Indeed, emphasizing this choice that they believed Americans faced over what would happen to them in the hereafter. Women and men who thought they were close to a religious breakthrough would sit near the front in what was called the anxious bench, where they would hopefully have their conversion experience. Americans saw the rapid growth of their nation and were filled with an optimism over what human beings could accomplish. And many of them came to believe that they could help bring about the millennium, the second coming of Jesus Christ. This optimism for the future and this religious fervor went in diverse directions, including utopian socialist communities, Millerites who believed they could determine God's time frame for Christ's return, the Church of Latter-day Saints, who of course ended up in Salt Lake City, Unitarians who emphasized science and rationality of the time. The optimism that Americans could bring about change when they looked at all this rapid interconnecting of markets also gave birth to diverse causes through which Americans sought to reform their communities, their nation, and the world. This included advocating for temperance, that is, the abdication of alcohol consumption completely, as well as Bible distribution, building asylums, sending missionaries to far-flung parts of the world, sending missionaries into inner cities like 5 Points in New York City, and advocating for an end to slavery, though the latter cause found few adherents south of the Mason-Dixon line. Temperance, though, won supporters across the country and was a relatively new impulse. American leaders before the beginning of the 19th century had cautioned about drinking to excess. Puritan theologian Increase Mather had cautioned in 1673 that, quote, drink is in itself a creature of God and to be received with thankfulness, but the abuse of drink is from Satan. The wine is from God, but the drunkard is from the devil. In other words, moderately imbibing was something God wanted you to enjoy, and that alcohol was only dangerous in excess. Likewise, Pennsylvania doctor and signer of the Declaration of Independence, Benjamin Rush, warned in his 1784 pamphlet, An Inquiry into the Effects of Ardent Spirits on the Human Mind and Body, that drinking in excess was dangerous. But he saw little harm in drinking less potent beverages, such as wine, beer, and cider, so long as it was in moderation, calling for an absolute end to drinking from people, as these reformers did, marked something new, and it connected well with the attitudes of this era, which came from these great economic shifts. For completely abstaining from alcohol promised greater self-control for Americans who were anxious about the perils of the marketplace. Children's literature, my research has been in children's history of childhood in the 19th century. Children's literature is filled with stories of respectable middle-class families who are prosperous. And then the father has one drink with friends and it always cascades. It's never like he never has a drink with friends and then goes about his business and his life is fine. He always has one drink with friends and it cascades into absolute drunkenness, utter poverty, and often, sometimes the father kills a child. It's always goes to the absolute worst possible situation. In addition, advocating for the complete abstinence from alcohol offered greater control for employers who were concerned that their workers that they employed. Gone were the days of apprentices who lived with their employers. Now, workers, after working extremely long and difficult days, would leave the sight of their employers. What were they doing during that time? Employers were anxious that their workers were getting drunk and wouldn't be as productive the next day. So advocating for temperance was beneficial for employers. And for a reform cause of the early 19th century, temperance was really effective. In 1830, Americans drank an average of 7.1 gallons of absolute alcohol, far more than they drink today. By 1845, that number had collapsed to 1.8 gallons. Moreover, shifting marketplaces, growing cities, and Americans who increasingly saw their skilled crafts transformed into de-skilled work that could be performed by workers with little training in sweatshops or mills, led to deepening class divisions and a tripartite class system. Meanwhile, these textile mills that were growing were being fed by cotton grown in the deep South where slavery remained legal. A middle class developed among Americans who were thought to work with their heads rather than their hands. This would include shopkeepers, teachers, lawyers, clerks. These people were key groups in this growing social class who took action to distinguish themselves from the working class Americans in a number of ways, including the products they consumed, spaces in which they performed their labor, the neighborhoods they lived in, the culture they enjoyed, and notably, and what I want to talk a little bit more about, I'm almost done, the ways in which they organized their families. The middle class organized their families' lives in ways that were distinguished from working class families. For instance, the middle class defined themselves through the prescribed role of women. Women had long been expected to take a subordinate role to their husband, but the work women often performed on a farm or a shop was often fairly similar to the work of their husband and was widely understood to be work. However, in the early 19th century, an ideology of separate spheres developed among middle-class families. Women, so the argument went, were naturally predisposed to home care rather than actual work. Therefore, women were expected to care for the family and the home, while men were supposed to be the exclusive bread earner and the sex which concerned itself with politics. Taking care of the home took on a spiritual significance for many middle-class Americans, as the home took on a role as a sacred space, a mental refuge from the anxiety stirred by this economic instability. The home was supposed to be removed from the world of work. This was nonsense, of course. Middle-class women worked very hard. But ideologically, the work they performed was not understood as work. At the same time, middle-class families were arguing and perceiving their children as innocent and in need of being sheltered from the workplace. It's ironic, I guess, that at the very same time that children are being sent more and more to work for wages among the working class in mills and mines, middle-class children are being increasingly removed from the marketplace, being sheltered in the home and in schools. middle-class families who are now seeing children not as a source of family income, but as an expense, are having fewer children. It's a pretty dramatic decline. Families had something like 8 children in 1800, the average was 5 by 1850, and 3.5 by 1900. So middle-class Americans, their family life is shifting, and in ways that demonstrated their economic prosperity. To have women a wife who worked in the household rather than earned wages, to have children that didn't earn income. This cost money and was demonstrative of a family's economic prosperity. So these economic changes that have been highlighted today had broad social, economic, and cultural impacts. Alexis de Tocqueville, in his 1831 classic work, Democracy in America, exclaimed that, quote, "America is a land of wonders, in which everything is in constant motion, and every change seems an improvement." In this quote, de Tocqueville encapsulates the progress and growth of the era that was addressed by the other panelists today. And indeed, this market revolution helped lead to our modern global economy, shaping social classes, culture, changes in culture, changes in religion, and changes to the American family. Thank you.
David, one of the industries we failed to cover tonight is the distilleries.
Oh, yeah.
And there were local distilleries scattered throughout the countryside, mostly making liquor from fruit. But then later, the rye whiskey distilleries grew both in the Finksburg area and in the Westminster area. We have several questions in our chat, and I'll run through them. If Alex is still with us, one of the questions was about the map of Baltimore. And if you could explain again how people can access the map, Alex.
Sure. So if you just kind of search bearings of Baltimore map, you'll find it there. Or if you type in Baltimore interactive map of 1815, you'll be able to find it there as well.
Very good. It is a fascinating resource to have an interactive map. Obviously, there are a number of books on maps of Maryland. The Hammond Harwood House book is frequently referred to, and there are many individual maps through the years of the port, but turning it into an interactive map of 1815 is fascinating. Another question that we have is regarding the toll roads and how long they remain toll roads. I know that at one time, about 1810, there was an effort to create plank roads, and there was a subscription for a plank road to run from Westminster to Meadowbrook, where the Roop's Mill was. Of course, the planks didn't last very long, and so that sort of ran out of favor. But Sam, tell us a little bit more about the turnpikes.
So, thank you. The funding for the turnpikes was a major kind of innovation of the turnpike system that developed in Maryland, because they were essentially privately operated and privately run. The tolls provided the capital for the maintenance of the roads. Initial investment was provided, and then subscribers received stock, and then users paid a user fee to use the roads. That was called a toll. And that was a very successful system that existed throughout the 1800s. But as time went on, there was growing resistance. There were other roads that were not toll roads, and you could kind of bypass the toll booths. And there was an increasing resistance to paying tolls, and an anti-toll movement grew around the turn of the 20th century. And then at least for the Reisterstown Turnpike, it was bought by the the predecessor, the State Roads Commission, in 1915. So you were paying tolls on the Reisterstown Road until 1915. And at that point, it became a state road.
Yes, I think there's sort of two Reisterstown roads, one that runs through Westminster, through Union Mills, and the other one that runs up through Hampstead and Manchester, Route 30. In Harvey Slichter's book on 2 Centuries of Grace and Growth in Manchester, he says there were toll houses located at either end of town, and they were operating to about the same time you say, Sam, 1915, 1920. We also had a question about the enslaved populations at the iron furnaces. There's sort of a reawakening in history of looking at the enslaved population and their craftsmanship. Historic Annapolis has looked at craftsmen who operated with enslaved populations, such as John Shaw. In Winston-Salem, MESDA, the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts, has done a lot of programming on the enslaved populations, working as furniture makers, potters, other crafts. Elizabeth, tell us a little bit more about the enslaved populations. The question specifically was if they diminished over time at the iron furnaces, where were they going?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. And we know that there was knowledge transfer from Africa to the New World because of the millennia of iron making that was in the Iron Belt of Africa and other areas of Africa as well. And that inherent knowledge, even if you weren't working in iron, you were familiar with, you had familiarity with the industry. It was very widespread. So we feel confident that that knowledge transfer took place and was one of the things that made the enslaved attractive to the iron workers as part of industrial slavery. So one of the ways that the skilled iron workers went into the larger population may be in the form of blacksmithing. In the 19th century, and Carroll County has many examples of this, as does Frederick County, there were many black blacksmiths. And those individuals were familiar with working iron, and they were able then to take advantage of that skill in an industry in which they could operate their own blacksmithing shop. Unfortunately, as we have very few blacksmiths now, that skill is not as prevalent in the black population, in the African American population, as it was. However, if you go to Charleston and Savannah and New Orleans, there is a great tradition of ironworking that is still, can still be seen in the African American population. So great story, and just so you know, that's one of the things that we are working very hard to bring back to Catoctin Furnace, and that is African American blacksmithing.
Very good. We've had comments from a number of the organizations. Alex has provided in the comment the link to the Bearings map, as well as the Historical Society of Carroll County provided that information, Union Mills Homestead, and Catoctin Furnace. So if you are looking for close to home things to do, as the weather gets nice and the facilities start to reopen, we encourage you to visit these organizations: Union Mills Homestead, Catoctin Furnace, the Maryland Historical Society, now known as the Maryland Center for History and Culture, and the Historical Society of Carroll County. They have excellent resources on all of the topics that we've talked about tonight. I want to thank each of the panelists that we've had and turn everything back to Dorothy Stoltz at the Carroll County Public Library.
Thank you so much, Joe, and thank you for such a wonderful, wonderful presentation. And we did have a question whether or not the program will be available later, and the recording of the program will be immediately available on all of the social media. So you can go to the library's Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, as well as all the Facebook pages of our partners. So please share it. And this was very rich with tremendous thought and research and various points of interest in bringing the Carroll County history and our regional history alive here. And so thank you all so very much. It's been such a pleasure to revisit the founding era locally and how it was significant to our emerging country. And I'm going to close out here with a slide, a couple of slides here, just a reminder that people can pick up or rather email me which book they would like to have from tonight's program. It's a free book, The Essential Hamilton, The Rules of Civility from George Washington, and then also Benjamin Franklin's Wit and Wisdom. And I'm putting that into the chat right now. So there you have that. And so once again, just to thank all of our fabulous sponsors and partners, and many thanks, Judge Joe Getty, and all panelists. So thank you all for attending.